Merci, bienvenue, welcome. My name is Suzanne Vanden Hogan, and I'm the Dean of the University Library and Archives at St. Mary's. So on behalf of the university, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's public lecture, Finding Molly Johnson, Catholics and the Faith of Irish Famine Orphans, 1847 to 1848, by Dr. Mark McGowan. Before we begin this evening's lecture, I wish to acknowledge Mi'kmaq, the land upon which we meet, and the lands from which you may reside. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations, and to recognize that we are all treaty people. As we open our hearts and minds to the past, we commit ourselves to work in a spirit of truth and reconciliation to make a better future for all. St. Mary's University acknowledges that our university is located on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Mi'kmaq peoples. This territory is governed by the treaties of peace and friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey peoples first signed in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey title and established the rules for what was to become ongoing relationships between nations. And on that note, I will pass the mic to my colleague.
I am a co-conspirator with Dr. Margaret MacDonald on making this evening possible, without whose effort we would not be having this event. But I'm also here to greet Dr. Mark McGowan, an Emeritus Professor of History and Celtic Studies at the University of Toronto and the former Principal of St. Michael's College, also at the University of Toronto. And also, I'd be remiss not to mention that he is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada as well. Professor McGowan's work spans many subjects, but perhaps those of greatest interest for us this evening is his work on the history of the Catholic Church in Canada and the long legacies of the Irish famine and its orphans. The title of today's lecture comes from his most recent of 8 books, entitled Finding Molly Johnson, The Irish Famine Orphans in Canada. The book engages in the histories of migration and movement of these Catholic bodies into a Protestant context. He is particularly attentive to the struggles for integration and identity retention during the upheavals and trauma. Molly Johnson of the title was made famous by a historical minute, which I believe we'll be watching shortly. But the historical record is considerably crueler mistress than the imaginations of these CBC producers would have us believe, because the search for Molly Johnson is in the margins of bigger histories, and it's through seams and nooks and crannies that historians have to maneuver. And this evening we have an extraordinary guide with us. On behalf of the Department for the Study of Religion, please join me in welcoming Dr. McGowan.
Okay, in the back row? Excellent. Okay, good. As I say, I'm very familiar. I mean, the last talk I gave actually was in Halifax to the Charitable Irish Society. Many of you may remember it because it was in between blizzards, just before the pandemic. And Don Reardon picked me up at the airport. He said, "Mark, don't worry about a thing. This is going to be just fine. We've had our snow." Well, St. Patrick's Day, the snow forecast does not look good by the afternoon. We're midway through the dinner, the snow is falling, and the next thing you know, I'm snowed in Halifax for an extra day during this March break. And I'm from the Ottawa Valley, so I love snow, I love wind, and while all Haligonians were sort of, hunkering down, I walked down the middle of Barrington Street with no traffic, and the only piece of equipment out there was a CBC van, and they wanted to know why this lunatic wearing a Toronto Maple Leafs toque was walking down the middle of Barrington Street. And the next thing you know, I'm getting a message on my phone. My wife Eileen is in Ottawa visiting her mom. She said, "You're on the CBC News tonight. What are you doing?" So So that was my last adventure in Halifax, and one of the things that wasn't mentioned, I'm actually an adjunct professor here as well because of a project that I engaged with a number of members of the Holy Cross Cemetery Historical Trust with the Gorsbrook Institute here at St. Mary's and with the Canadian Catholic Historical Association and the Archdiocese of Halifax. And so I'd really like to dedicate this lecture tonight to a dear friend who passed away in February, Brian O'Brien. And I know that his work, his fantastic work, not just as a world-class ophthalmologist and surgeon, but also as one who was so dedicated to keeping the story alive, the story of the Irish here, and the renovation to that cemetery is absolutely spectacular. I walked through it again today, and all I could think of was, Brian, you just did well. You did so very, very well. So tonight, I'm pleased to be here to think about good friends in Halifax, and particularly Brian, and his just reward, I know. So tonight, perhaps I should preface this lecture by saying that it's the product of many hands. One of the things that I did while I was employed at the University of Toronto was try to engage senior undergraduate students in the real work of a historian. And that is, instead of listening to talking heads like myself through lectures for 4 years in their degree program, to choose among those who were truly interested and among the brightest to work and engage in actual historical research projects. So tonight really is not just my work, it's the work of 5 teams of senior undergraduates who have now gone on to marvelous careers both in academia and in the public sector and in the private sector, but learned how to do hard research in such exciting things as census and tax assessment rolls, cemetery records, birth records, and the like. And 1,700 famine orphans were in their hands, and we would meet every Friday in my office, depending on the year and which team, and they referred to it as the Circle of Fear because they each had their own lists and they would report on what they found each week, and then we would analyze that. So their work of those 5 teams, and I mention them in my book because their work was invaluable, and I think it was one of the most satisfying things I did as a historian in the academy was in a sense trying to recruit a new generation to engage in social historical work. And so that book is as much a product of their efforts, and so some of the slides tonight, which I'll acknowledge. But before we go to the slides, and if my Luddite tendencies don't fail me here, I will press escape, and I will go to something that those of you who were around in the 90s may very well remember.
Molly Johnson.
In the 1850s, many Quebec families adopted Irish orphans, their parents dead of ship's fever on the Atlantic crossing.
Alors Molly, voici ton nouveau père et ta nouvelle mère. Dorénavant, tu porteras le nom fier et historique de Bélanger. Tu es maintenant une petite Canadienne, Molly.
No, we have to keep our Irish name. Mon mère me l'a dit juste avant le serment. We have to pour la mémoire de mon patrie.
Ça, monseigneur, ça me paraît tout à fait acceptable.
Quel est ton nom, mon enfant?
Johnson, Sir Molly Johnson.
Et comment t'appelles-tu, toi?
Patrick. Patrick O'Neill.
Et toi?
Kathleen Royan.
A century and a half later, many of those names still resound in Quebec.
So it's interesting when you watch that vignette, Molly Johnson and all of the others. It's produced in the mid-90s at a time when Canada is in grave crisis nationally. Some of you will remember the Quebec referendum of 1995 that that passed by just a sliver for Quebec to remain in Canada or not negotiate sovereignty, association, or separation. And note the way in which this foundation then uses the Irish as kind of that bridge between the two host settler peoples of the country. Also note that she speaks better French than I do coming off a boat after 6 weeks. I mean, it was really quite startling. But the interesting thing is they chose those names quite deliberately. There were 3 Quebec premiers who bore the surname Johnson. You notice that the little girl, Kathleen Ryan, Claude Ryan was a massive figure in the Non movement, and of course, how many O'Neills were there in politics and in literature in Quebec? This was all very, very well crafted. But where would they get such an idea? And of course, those key lines, Molly, here is your new father and your new mother. You will now have the proud name Bélanger. You are a Canadian now, Molly, and no, and the resistance. So one of the things that I do and what my teams did was test what many Canadians see as their only experience of the Irish famine on television and of those children. And so tonight, I really don't want to be myth-busting too much, but I'd like for you to appreciate the way in which historical research works as we try to get behind the film, get behind the myth-making, and try to figure out what elements there are worth embracing, and which ones should be held with a degree of skepticism, okay? So it was almost as if they scripted this out of a book called The Irish in America by John Francis McGuire, written in 1880. It was as if John Francis McGuire had actually written the screenplay for this, okay? When he wrote in this book, and it was, nobly was the unconscious appeal of destitute little ones responded to by French Canadians, half-naked, squalid, covered with vermin, generated by hunger, fever, and the foulness of the ship's hold, perhaps with germs of the plague lurking in their vitiated blood, these helpless innocents of every age, from the infant taken from the bosom of its dead mother to the child who could barely tell the name of its parents, were gathered under the fostering protection of the church. No, I mean, the Irish, we all know that our people can be over the top in some cases. But this scripted beautifully for this vignette in terms of setting up what you saw, from the somber violin music and that line of ragged children coming down the stairs in what appeared to be an episcopal palace in front of Joseph Signy, the Archbishop of Quebec, as these children are about to be moved to various French-Canadian families, standing as a gauntlet, for these children to walk through. So where would they get this idea? Probably from John Francis McGuire. But there's a number of problems right from the very beginning, and we'll go to that. So tonight, I'm going to look at what was meant by an orphan in British North America, how different parts of British North America deal, okay, with the whole question of orphans. Now imagine, in 1847 alone, 110,000 people boarded ships, refugees of the Irish famine, and landed, those who were still alive, somewhere in British North America. And we've counted thus far about 1,700 orphaned children, either orphaned on the voyage or orphaned once their parents died, or at least one parent died, in the fever sheds in places like St. John, New Brunswick, in Quebec, in Montreal, and further inland. You're going to probably say, well, what happened in Halifax? Well, actually, Halifax had very few famine migrants, only about 2,000 over that sailing season, because there already was a potato blight happening here. In Cape Breton, in Pictou County, in Guysborough, and in Antigonish. And Sir John Harvey, the governor of the colony, wrote to the colonial office and said, there's nothing for these refugees here. Please don't send them to Halifax. There was a quarantine station at Melville Island, but the major centers of this activity that I'll talk about tonight are not here in Halifax, they're elsewhere, okay? What's the nature of adoption? What happens to these adoptions, okay? So, first of all, think differently about orphan. That there are essentially three different kinds of orphans that appear in this story. First is the classic notion of a child without either parent. The next is someone who is orphaned only because one parent is dead, and they're referred to in the record as half orphans, okay? And then there are those with both parents who, trying to seek or eke out a living somehow to raise money for their children, place those children in the protective care of either an asylum in a place like New Brunswick or with a religious order. And there the Catholic Church provides, and I think centrally to our story, an infrastructure that's not provided by central governments. Central governments provide immigrant agents. Central governments provide local relief. There's a poor law in New Brunswick, but it really is, and McGuire is right here, there is this fostering protection of the church that essentially steps into the breach to give as much relief as they can. Adoption. These children are not adopted. There are no laws of essentially legalizing adoption in any of the colonies in this period. Now, in Quebec, or in the French colonies, they refer to adoption colloquially. But because of the rights of inheritance, people were reluctant to formally adopt and then see that their farms or their wealth pass on to a child who was not their blood relation. We don't actually have formal adoption laws in Canada until New Brunswick passes them in the 1870s. In fact, I have a copy of the droit civil, the civil code of Quebec. It was rewritten before Confederation. It was rewritten in 1866, and it doesn't anticipate adoption at all. If a non-genetic, so to speak, child was to inherit, it would have to go through a notary or an attorney of some sort. So the fact that these children are not adopted, I think, is significant. So different view of orphan, different view of adoption. So I think we should really think of placement, that these children are actually placed. Okay? And that will be really important as we try to discover what happens to them in the long run. Okay? So the Roman Catholic Church, as I said, is key. It's available in terms of its structures in most British North American ports. Although you're going to see, I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey tonight. And that journey will start on the East Coast and it will work as far as Toronto, where everything seems to end. But the thing about this is that the migration at that point is essentially over as families move to the United States or centrally into parts of what is now Ontario. And so if you're really finding me tedious tonight, you know, when I get towards Kingston, you know I'm almost done, all right? So it's just, okay. But it's the priests, the religious orders, and lay men and women who actually are the ones hard at work to make sure that these children have sustenance, and for the bishops and for the priests and others, they're preserved for the faith. Okay? Now that's not to say Protestant groups didn't engage in this. The Anglican Church under Bishop George Mountain, who was serving both as Bishop of Montreal and as Bishop at Quebec City, he actually gathers the small number of orphan children. We discovered about 100 Protestant orphans. So regardless of denomination, the Anglican bishop, being essentially representing more of the established church, actually brings most of the Protestant orphans to an asylum in Montreal. So I don't want to be, how shall we say, denominationally exclusive, but to know that Protestant churches were also working hand in glove with civil authorities to do something about these. So just a quick Coles Notes, remember those Coles Notes, that the quick overview of the famine and what it means in 1847. So 110,000 people set out from United Kingdom ports, Irish and British ports. Nova Scotia, as I said, 2,000 arrived there. Brunswick, 17,000. Quebec in the United Province of Canada, about 90,000. Quebec receives 400 ships alone in the sailing season from June to October of 1847. And we also have quarantine stations in all of these areas, Gros-Île being one of the most famous in the St. Lawrence River, and close to 5,000 people are buried on Gros-Île in 1847 alone. Stricken with typhus, typhoid, we've even found evidence of smallpox that had broken out on that island. Melville Island here off Halifax, Point Saint Charles in Montreal, Emily and King Streets in Kingston, and then finally Reese's Wharf in Toronto. So all of these become hotspots where orphans essentially are made, okay, if they've not already arrived on shore without parents. Most cases, orphans aren't sent alone, but that we did discover some cases where some landlords did put them on ships, particularly in County Sligo, where two notorious landlords were at play. So let's start in New Brunswick. We'll start geographically here. Province founded in 1784. Essentially a province that's linked, quite by common sense, to a port at Cork or Cove, Queenston in those days, and Derry. So it's interesting that the Irish who arrive in New Brunswick are quite distinctive from the ones who have already come to places like Newfoundland from the southeast of Ireland that Cyril Byrne used to talk about. I mean, the Wexford and Waterford people. These folks are from Cork, coming to New Brunswick, and from the north. And so you actually have a very strong Protestant Irish presence in New Brunswick, particularly coming out of the port of Derry. And that's going to be an important element in this story as to what happens when Irish Catholic children, who are the majority, land in a Protestant town like St. John, and also the Protestant settlements up the St. John River Valley, okay, as far as Woodstock, Grand Falls, and places like that. So, I don't know if you could read that carefully. About 17,000 land. This is actually the cross at Partridge Island, which is the clearing station as folks land. And as you can see, about 800 die at sea en route to St. John, New Brunswick, and about 1,300 in quarantine. The emigration agent there is Moses Purley, and we have the death of a first responder. One of the projects I've been involved with is trying to gather the names of the first responders who died, and it was particularly within the context of COVID that we became much more aware of Canadians and others who lost their lives on the front line. This was a young Irish doctor, James Patrick Collins, and he died actually serving the immigrants coming in to Partridge Island, and he's one of 84 first responders that we've managed to identify, many of whom were priests and women religious, particularly in places like Montreal and further inland. So people who laid down their lives, okay? One of the problems here, though, is that the ships that are landing in St. John, I'm just going to move so I can actually read this slide for those in the back a little bit more carefully here. Sorry, cameraman. Okay. So Moses Purley talks about how awful the conditions on board these ships are, that families are arriving half naked, and mostly from Lord Palmerston's estate, okay, in County Sligo, where they've been shoveled on board ships and been sent to New Brunswick in order to fend in the New World. In fact, in November of 1847, after the sailing season was practically over and they were closing down the island, another one of Lord Palmerston's ships lands, the Eolus, and it is one of the worst ships as described by Moses Purley here. Another ship from John Gore Booth, or Robert Gore Booth's estate, the Lady Sail, lands, and at least he reports they have been well fed and cared for on the voyage, and food has been distributed among them, but I have never seen such abject misery, destitution, and helplessness as was exhibited yesterday on the decks of the Lady Sail. This is just the tip of the descriptions made by the chief medical officer. He found one boy who was brought on board, on deck, practically naked, okay, and in adverse weather conditions. This was certainly, how shall we say, one of the worst situations that Purley had ever seen. This is actually the orphans' asylum that was created in New Brunswick just to house the over 300 orphans who arrived there. So 310 orphans were preserved in a ledger, and it was the work of a local historian who preserved this ledger after many of the buildings had burned down, and it was found in an attic. And a scholar by the name of Murphy uncovered it, and we've been able to go through it. 91% of those 310 children were actually Roman Catholic. But they had landed in a town where the Catholic Church had very little infrastructure. Okay, so this gives you a kind of a sense of the St. John orphans that land. Most were from County Sligo, from the estates of Gore Booth and from Palmerston. There were some from Galway close by, but the poor law did not distinguish between which child went to which placed house. And since the majority of farmers in New Brunswick at the time were Protestant, and all but one of the guardians of the Poor Law Union in St. John were Protestant, it meant that only 12% of the patrons who actually took in children were actually Roman Catholic. Now, why did the Catholic Church allow this? They didn't have much choice, okay? Bishop Dollard was actually stationed in Fredericton. It was the Diocese of Fredericton. He had to go to St. John and stay there in order to try to manage things. He had two priests there, a Father Sweeney, who eventually would become bishop in the province, and a Father Quinn, and they assisted. But because the Catholic Church had no female or male religious order in the city, they were virtually at the mercy of the guardians of the poor law. And these children were placed essentially in Protestant homes. Now, what happened to them religiously, we're not quite sure, because the 1851 census, which is our best record, doesn't include religion. So we can find some of the patrons, and we can find some of the children, but the thing is that we don't know whether these Catholic children in 3 years were listed as Protestant or Catholic, because religion simply wasn't listed. And so we would have to go to the next census. And by that time, one of the things we have to remember is in the 19th century, populations are mobile. So it's very hard to find these children. But we did document several who went both ways. Some continued to be Catholics despite being placed in Protestant homes, and others became Protestants after the families with whom they were placed. Dollard had very little influence, and so the St. John story is completely different from the stories that we see in the other colonies, okay? Which is really important to remember. What happens? And I said 48% were placed with farmers. And there's a little bit of, how should we say, nine orphans we discovered in 1851. The asylum ran until 1849, and so after that, there's very little follow-up by public authorities as to what happens to these children. In a sense, most of them were lost in history. So I tell some of the stories in the book that we discovered, you know, of little children who lost their parents in the fever hospital in St. John, and then eventually were moved out into farms. And in fact, the head of of the orphanage actually sent a number of children to his estates in Digby, Nova Scotia. So they were used essentially as cheap labor on many of these farms. And that's one of the things that we discover is not just, how should we say, germane to New Brunswick. It's going to happen again and again elsewhere. We're moving inland to Quebec City. That's actually Bishop Signé, who was probably portrayed by a much younger man in the vignette. Joseph Signé was in charge of the Diocese of Quebec. Officially, he was an archbishop, but in the eyes of the civil authorities, he was still a bishop. Here, there was no religious order that was non-cloistered, so the people who actually gathered up the children were lay women, the charitable Catholic ladies of Quebec. And what they did was they gathered the children together at the docks after they were landed from a quarantine at Gros-Île, and they marched them up to an orphanage where we have excellent records. And there I thank my late colleague Mariana O'Gallagher, a former sister of charity who was in Quebec, devoted her life to the study of Gros-Île, and she actually transcribed the ledger that was kept by the Catholic ladies. So I refer to that as the O'Gallagher list, because when you transcribe something, some things go amiss, and when you're transcribing from 19th century penmanship, sometimes the names are less than accurate. So we call it the O'Gallagher list because it is a bit different in its transcription from the original list. And when we went back to the original list, we corrected some names. But in this orphanage, okay, we encounter 619 children. And the work of a Parks Canada historian, Marie-Claude Belay, found more, so about 702. And as you can see here, they are distributed. One of the things that Signé does is he appoints his Vicar General, Félix Cazot, as kind of the master planner. And the game plan within Quebec is that the church has infrastructure, unlike St. John, New Brunswick. And so Cazot designates parish priests to do a variety of things. One, they have to spend a week on Gros-Île, serving the people at the quarantine station. And then they have to essentially poll their parishioners, okay, and ask their parishioners if they need help on their farms or in their businesses. And that's the way in which the church then takes these children and, according to Signé and Cazot, preserves their faith. And if you can imagine wagons being drawn up to Prince Edward Street and to that orphanage, and then children being called out of the orphanage and then put on these wagons and then taken to points in the interior where they can't speak the language at all. Some of the children would speak Irish, some of the children could speak English, but it was very difficult to communicate. But we've got a couple of really interesting case studies that show that. So the largement placement area was in the Quebec area, and this is significant because Quebec had just suffered a massive fire. And yet, despite all of the loss in Quebec City, not 18 months before because of a fire, they actually took in children. And what we discovered is not just French-Canadian families, but Irish families who were already there, who were pre-famine migrants. So here's another corrective to that tale. If you were to accurately portray that gauntlet of people waiting for orphans to come down, if such a thing ever happened, okay, you would see Irish families, okay, first and second generation Irish families who were also there. About 1/3 of the families in which children were placed were actually placed within Irish families, okay? And Irish patrons in the city along Lower Town, in Valcartier, and joining basically a large population of Irish that were already in St. Patrick's Parish. We've been able to identify 357 of them in the census as to where they went in the Quebec area. The second biggest place was Lotbinière on the South Shore, agricultural county. south of the St. Lawrence River. And there, you see, you had priests taking them into a variety of parishes and some Irish parish or farms in the area. The problem is the 1851 census, which would be our best source, is lost for Lotbinière in this period. Yeah, it's kind of like cage fighting with one arm tied behind your back sometimes to do this kind of research. But there are parish registers, okay, baptismal registers, death registers, and we use those as kind of surrogates. Interestingly enough, there was a family called the Tighe family. They were from County Roscommon. And Daniel and Catherine Tighe, one aged 12, Catherine aged 9, were orphaned. Their mother had already been widowed in Ireland, and she convinced her brother, William Kelly, to take them. And we know this story because of the people in this picture, okay? So Daniel and Catherine Tighe are all that remain of a family of 6 in the crossing. They can't speak French, and they're taken by a Father Lebel to a farm in Lotbinière, to a childless couple, Marie and François Coulomb. And of course, they needed a young boy on the farm. They take Daniel off the wagon, and of course, this is the only person left in Catherine Tighe's world. And so she kicks up a fuss, and kicks it up so much that Marie Coulomb actually says, we'll take them both. Daniel Tighe, through a notary, eventually inherits the Coulomb farm. Young Catherine Tighe becomes a housekeeper for the local parish priest in Lotbinière, Father Cote, who's also taking care of his widowed father. So she works as a domestic servant in that house. The people you see in this picture here, and I think there might be a pointer on that. 2 men and a woman in the middle. The woman in the middle is Carolyn Callery of the National Famine Museum in Ireland, because the Tighes, T-I-G-H-E, were from her estate, the estate that was purchased by the Callery family and is now the National Famine Museum in Ireland. The 2 men on either side are Gilles and Richard Tighe, the great-grandsons of Daniel Tighe. And Richard Tighe, the taller man with the gray hair, died only recently, but he still held the farm that his great-grandfather had inherited. And we received this story through oral tradition, passed down by Léon Tighe, Richard's father and Gilles' father, who actually lived with his grandfather Daniel. And the Tighes became Gallicized. They changed their name, T-Y-E. And they became une famille française. So they became essentially Québécois, but never forgot the Irish roots, because Daniel Tighe passed that story down to Léon, and my colleague Mariana O'Gallagher picked it up from Léon, and then suddenly we were able to pull together this story of one set. Most of these children, though, end up as day workers, as we find in the census on farm, journaliers, okay? Workers, servants. The girls helped in the home, the boys worked in the field, okay? This was a cheap labor program for farmers both in New Brunswick and now in Quebec, okay? 2 Quinn brothers, also from the same estate, end up with the gatekeeper at the seminary at Nicolet. They both become priests, Father Thomas and Father Patrick Quinn. And become celebrated defenders of French-Canadian rights when the Maudits Irlandais, the damned Irish of Ontario, are trying to curtail French-language schools. And who stands up? We remember what they did for us. But these are just a few stories from there. One of the bigger placements is in Rimouski, the rural catchment area far to the east of Quebec before you get to the Gaspé. The population, there were only about 3.9% of the area claimed Irish ancestry, and right now, today, the aggregate is about 5.5%. It's almost an exclusively French-speaking area, and we track children into this area as well, okay? So about 300 kilometers east of Quebec, and that's some derivation. There was no road to the Rimouski area until the 1830s. So you can imagine this is frontier Quebec. And we have a number of children that are taken there, mostly here by Father Lebel, and it's hard to read, at least from my vantage point. Father Lebel spent time at Grosse-Île. He buried dozens of people and convinced Signé that he could take upwards of 70 children back to Saint-Germain-de-Rimouski, the parish there. Okay. Lebel buried about 123 people on Grosse-Île in that 1 week. So he was convinced that he could bring these children and give them a new start. We found 26 of them. 26 of them living on farms in 1851, doing exactly as I just said, working as essentially field workers or workers in the home. Some actually went to school, and there's a Father des Trois Maisons, I love his name, Father Three Houses, okay, of the Three Houses. He reports back to the bishop that the youngest ones who can't work are now in the local school, and they're becoming, how should we say, really good young French children. So they're learning the French language and becoming essentially Gallicized, okay? That's the Father des Trois Maisons rectory in Rimouski. Okay, some of the Rimouski orphans have interesting backstories. I've mentioned a few of them here. The McManus brothers from Toronto are particularly interesting because they become employees without pay in a local hotel run by an Irish immigrant himself. And when we looked into this property, we discovered this guy knew how to get cheap help because he had boys slinging beer in his saloon, and he had girls, young orphan girls, changing beds and emptying out spittoons and the like. So, I mean, it just reinforced the fact that the romantic diddly-diddly ending at the end of that vignette that you saw certainly didn't resonate with some of these children. There were 5 Dempsey sisters from Kildare, and we were able actually to track a number of them. One of them actually stayed in Rimouski, and we found her in the burial records. She had died in Rimouski about 11 years after arriving there. Some legacies. And these are the stories the students loved to dig up, okay? The woman with the mink stole on there, her name was Josie Court. She was the granddaughter of Nowlin, who was adopted or placed in an Irish family outside of Quebec City. He had married a local pre-famine Irish woman. They had children. She married a fellow by the name of Court. But she's interesting because John Diefenbaker appoints her to the Canadian Senate, okay, in the 1950s, a granddaughter of the Irish orphans. Larry Zolf, that political commentator, once described her as noted for her broad-brimmed hats, her Lauren Bacall voice, and her ability to sniff out Bolsheviks. So I couldn't make this up if I tried. The other, her name is Catherine Kennedy. I refer to this portrait as Canadian Gothic. She marries a cousin of the farmer with whom she is placed, the Caron family. And with Caron, she has several children and dies in the 1870s. But you can see here that some of the fate of some of these orphans is that they marry into French-Canadian and Irish-Canadian families and actually stay. Most in this catchment area move on and we lose them to history, okay? This one we don't. And this is a really odd story because this is actually one of the Mahoney daughters. There were 6 daughters of Patrick Mahoney. His wife dies, okay, in Coolmeen, which is in County Clare. And so they arrive in Quebec in 1848. And here's a problem that I mentioned about transcribing the original. It was transcribed as coal meals. Well, that really challenged my geographical knowledge of Ireland. I thought I had pretty much a good handle on names, but it was actually Coolmeen was the name of the village and townland. So his youngest, one of the younger daughters, Ellen, dies, and he places, three of his daughters in the orphanage in Quebec City, and they're taken to Rimouski, to the Mavignon, Pinot, and Larouche families. They're on the O'Gallagher list. He keeps his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, who is portrayed in this portrait, and his youngest daughter, Nancy. They remain with him. And what does he do? He follows his daughters to Rimouski and then boards with a French-Canadian family so he can be within safe distance of his remaining daughters. I haven't seen any other evidence of this happening in any family. But Elizabeth Mahoney marries a local farmer. So much like Catherine Kennedy, she marries a local farmer, and they have 10 children, okay, big Catholic family, okay, and move to the Saguenay region in 1871. He dies in 1911, and she died in Bercemy. We were able to track all this, and then lo and behold, we decided to check to see if there was any other evidence. And apparently our family tree was correct because it matched up with this family actually tracking themselves on Ancestry. And we found this note from Yolande Miller, who was a great-great-granddaughter, and she said, and I translated from the French here, my great-great-grandmother, her family left Ireland during the Great Famine for a better world. Such great suffering for this family. She lost her mother during the journey, separated from her sisters. She did not speak the language French. What courage she had, this builder. Thank you, great-great-grandmother. She transmitted to us courage and to stand up strongly. I love you. Now that you don't find in the census. But we could track everything in the census, including the fact that she still listed English as her mother tongue. In the last census before she died. Now, she must have been bilingual, or it was just the language of love with her spouse, who's French-Canadian. Okay, we're getting inland now, Montreal. So, Montreal, leading commercial center at the time, okay. It has a population of just under 30,000, and here again, the churches take a lead in orphan placement, okay. Close to half the city is English speaking. There is already a large Irish community in Montreal, so there is a place for the orphans to gather. Ignace Bourget is the bishop. He takes charge. But here we see the active role of women's religious orders. And without them, first of all, the orphans don't have much hope, okay? And secondly, we don't have good records. So the records of the Grey Sisters, the Sœurs de Grise, today is the feast day of Marguerite Youville, their founder. They were on the front lines in the fever sheds, and a number of the Grey Sisters lost their lives serving the children. They actually built a separate shed for the orphans, basically to keep them from contagion at Point Saint Charles, and also to keep them from les maudits protestants. Okay, it was the evil Protestants, okay? So the religious orders, they were assisted by a new religious order founded by Mother Gamelin, the Sisters of Providence, and they actually ran the orphanage that was created specifically for these circumstances. The saint, as you can see, the Saint Jerome Emiliani, who is actually the patron saint of orphans, and so they named the orphanage after Saint Jerome Emiliani. And another religious order, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, also take in girls. So the religious orders are absolutely critical to orphan reception in Montreal. This portrait, hopefully you can see it, it's the only painting extant of the famine in Canada. It was painted by Théophile Hamel. It was commissioned by Ignace Bourget, and actually what it does is it depicts all of the religious orders who were active. There's a a Grey Sister in the front dealing with famine victims and children, and then a Sister of Providence, then a Sister of the Good Shepherd, and of course Bourget, of course, is painted in the background. He actually contracts typhus and nearly dies, but survives the ordeal. I was saying to the class this morning, I was talking to it, this is actually on the ceiling of Notre-Dame de Bon Secours in Montreal Harbor. So I had to get on my back to take the picture of the things you do for history. You know, it's just, it's that. It's now been removed to be restored as of last month, but if you're ever at that chapel, there it is. We've discovered, because of the lists that were compiled by these sisters, we have a really good sense of where these children went. And oftentimes, again, as in Quebec, parish priests would take them to their local parishes. They were also taken into the petit séminaire, some of the young men, to be educated, and others essentially move out into the districts of Quebec to work on farms and to work with artisans. And interesting there, here's another legacy. His name was Bartholomew Furlong. Okay, Bart Furlong. He had several siblings. He left with his siblings James and Margaret from the Grey Sisters in Montreal and were sent essentially to a farm in Glengarry County, which is the first county that you reach when you cross the Quebec border into what is now Ontario. And that's where he worked. He was born in Wexford. He was a laborer in 1861, moved to the States, became a citizen there in 1871, and one of my students, Bridget Hager, discovered that he ended up owning the Alpine Hotel and Tavern, and we actually have a picture there of the tavern. So ferreting out every piece of information to give you a robust story. He actually marries Mary O'Rourke. She's an Irish-American, and he dies in 1891, leaving his wife a widow and 7 children. So he's just the tip of an iceberg of the children that we've traced in Montreal, and each one of them has an interesting and sometimes unique story. Okay, now we're going west. We're getting closer to the end, all right? Okay. That's the way you cross the Lachine Rapids back in the day. As you move from Durham Boat to Cornwall to Prescott to Brockville, or you take the alternate route up the Ottawa River to Bytown, which is now Ottawa. And there the Grey Sisters are there again. This is Elizabeth Bruyère. She was the superior of the Grey Sisters in Ottawa, in Bytown. She herself was an orphan. So serendipitously, in her 20s, she's sent to Ottawa to deal with setting up the Grey Sisters in Ottawa, Bytown at that time. They took in 64 orphans. And what's interesting about Ottawa is it was French-Canadian women living in the city that would take whole groups and then disperse them, and we don't know where they went. But we do have the ledger kept by the Grey Sisters. And of course, as luck would have it, the 1851 census for Ottawa is gone. Nowhere to be found. So again, the sources fail us. We go to Kingston. And here, Kingston is an interesting case because the fever sheds are not built apart from the city. They were going to build them on Wolfe Island, and then there was objections to that. They're actually, if you know Kingston, the streets, the sheds at Emily and King Streets, that's right downtown. So the other thing is that they do have an order of religious. The religious hospitallers of St. Joseph have been commissioned to build the Hôtel Dieu. And there are 1,200 deaths in Kingston that season, but the church tries to create the infrastructure. And the thing about it is that they hadn't finished the Hôtel Dieu at the time of the arrival of these Irish migrants. And so everything is done on the fly at the Hôtel Dieu. There are actually 5 famine monuments in Kingston. They went crazy. This one is at Skeleton Park or McBurney Park. But if you look at it carefully, they really don't know who's in the ground there because there's actually a thistle, a leek, a shamrock, and a rose in the parts of the. So many migrants could be there, and we don't even know if they're famine migrants, but nonetheless, what we do know is that the children were collected at the sheds and taken to the sisters at the Hotel Dieu. And actually on Christmas Eve, 70 children were essentially brought by Father Angus McDougall to the sisters. What do we do with them? And it's a heartrending story after that because, and I read from there, the children had to sit down on the floor around the stove. Remember, it's Christmas Eve. They were all cold, and we served them by rows. So if you could imagine rows of children with only 7 place settings, one would eat, they would wash the bowl, and then they would have their Christmas dinner, that way. And the sisters were very, very sorry to have to put them in such disgusting beds. They just weren't prepared, but this was the fate of 70 orphan children. And here's where we learn the difference between orphans without any parents and orphans who have been essentially using these church institutions as daycare. Because in the spring, 50 of these 70 children are collected and they go off with family members. So uncles, aunts, mothers, fathers pick up these children and move them into the interior. And we do find some outside the Kingston area, but guess what happened to the Kingston census for 1851? I don't even have to tell you. That's why I have gray hair. So they move on. So, well, we did develop a register of 71 children. One was a local. 36 were picked up by a parent, 6 were picked up by a sibling, 3 died in the hotel, 2 ran away. This is frequent when we're finding the ledger just say, ran away. One ledger said 5 children went to Lockport, New York. 5 orphan children in the same family. The Sheridans go to Lockport, New York. But we discovered that there's a Father Sheridan working a Catholic parish in Elmira. They were probably heading towards this relative from County Roscommon. So there's always a sense of agency here when they go to a specific place. We also found orphans in the local, what they would call the poor house, but the house of industry. And also a register in St. Mary's Cathedral. So we can actually say that about 700 immigrants died, 289 of which were children. So sometimes the story doesn't end well at all in Kingston. Oh, and now to Toronto. You know we're coming to the end. So by boat, they go from Kingston, some go to Hamilton, some go to the Niagara, some go to Toronto. Now understand that in 1847, there are only about 20,000 people in Toronto. Imagine between June and October of 1847, 38,000 refugees arrive in the city. Wow. Twice the population. The city is partially prepared. They have a fever hospital, which was the General Hospital, which is now the location of the Toronto International Film Festival building. I was part of a team of researchers and archaeologists that were unearthing the hospital back in 2008, 2009, and it drove the TIFF people nuts because we were taking our time in sort of excavating the site and finding things, and we did find things, delousing combs. And the prize was a harp badge that somebody had left at that point in the fever hospital. And of course, there were a number of fever sheds attached because the hospital was too small. And today, it's a place where people watch film, but there was a great drama there in 1847. The fellow who was chiefly responsible was Edward McElderry. He was actually from the north of Ireland, but a Catholic, and Bishop Power of the city placed him in charge of triaging all of the migrants who landed at Reese's Wharf. They were restricted to one wharf because of the typhus, that many of them were carrying a devastating communicable disease at the time. we now treat it with antibiotics, but at least 50% of the people who contracted typhus would die, okay? And it was important to clear them out of the city as quickly as possible if they were healthy, okay? But the problem with typhus is when you've been infected, the incubation period is about 10 days to 2 weeks. You could look perfectly healthy and still be carrying the disease, and the symptoms would show later. It reminded me when I was writing the book, it was during COVID, and I thought, how interesting. You may be infected with this disease, but the symptoms don't show for over a week. And it was the same. Allegedly healthy people are brought into a situation where they're actually spreading the disease. I worked with an epidemiologist earlier on the topic, and he said it's a hardy bacteria. It can live on blankets, it can live in dirt, and you can basically contract it even by sleeping in a filthy bed. But generally speaking, it was a louse that bit you, and then you infected yourself. You know how you get mosquito bites, and then they start to itch, and then the feces contain the bacteria, the rickettsia bacteria, and you infect yourself, and it gets into the bloodstream. This was a big problem in Toronto and in other cities. 1,124 people died in Toronto that season, not quite the 3,300 in Montreal, not quite the 1,200 in Kingston, but nonetheless, first responders died in this city, including the Catholic bishop. All of his priests are dead, and Michael Power, who was born on Hollis Street here in Halifax, first bishop of Toronto, is the only one left standing. His priests are all ill. He goes to the fever sheds every day. He contracts typhus in late September and dies on October 5th, 1847, just before his 43rd birthday. So we talk about the first responders with some degree of reverence who put their lives on the line, oftentimes on a daily basis. Okay, there he is, Michael Power, Halifax boy. One of the things that Toronto has had the reputation for is being the Belfast of North America, but in this particular case, Catholics and Protestants worked together. Power was highly respected by Edgerton Ryerson, one of the leading Methodists in the area, and John Strawn, the Anglican bishop. And they created, in 1847, a widows and orphans home. And there, 687 people essentially spent the day and the night, and 197 of those were orphans. They even devised an ecumenical grace that pleased both the Protestant and the Catholic clergy. They brought in a school teacher, and then, as we have seen elsewhere, priests came in to deliver the Catholic majority children to areas, farming areas, some as far away as Windsor, so the other side of the province. French-Canadian priests, Irish priests. Thaddeus Curwen was certainly the most important because he said, we're going to place these children with farmers of high moral character, okay? And they did. But here's the other thing about Toronto. We actually have formal contracts. It's the only place in Canada where we see formal contracts that sort of protect the child as they're placed in these homes. So for example, there was a rate of pay in the contract, okay? There was also clothing to be provided. Some children, we discovered, would end up with a cow at the end of the time when they were placed. Some with actually cash. So upon reaching the age of 21, if the orphan was still with the placed family, they would receive a remittance of $100. This was essentially an indenture contract, okay? And because of this, we were able to track some of them, hard to see on the green background, but we found 45. Peter Currens was placed with Michael O'Connor, farmer and a bricklayer in Vaughan, now the city above Toronto, and we find him still there in 1851, 4 years later. We find another, Mary Mahan. She's 5 years old and she goes to Jacob Crossan, farmer in York. She's still there in 1851. Now, why don't we find any kids in the city of Toronto? 3 guesses and you don't get the first 2. The census for Toronto in 1851 is nowhere to be found, okay? John Gallivan is one of my favorites because he's 16 years old and he's placed with Richard Butler, who's a farmer and a blacksmith in Whitby, and I live in Whitby, so this strikes close to home. And his rates of pay are set up accordingly. $25 for the first year, $35 for the second, $45 for the third, $50 for the fourth. But in 1851, Gallivan was gone. Yeah, the Whitby census is still there, but another Irish child had taken over. But this is really significant because what we have now is an actual record of what the terms of placement were in these families. And we can actually trace children as they sort of move through their adolescence and into adulthood. But none we've found have taken over the placement properties as Daniel Ty had. Okay? So, what kind of observations can we make at the end of this? I told you Toronto was going to be the end. Hopefully not for the Blue Jays tonight, but it'd be the end. Okay, so port cities differ in the way in which orphans are managed. The church is the dominant player, not a player, the dominant player in making sure that these children are cared for in some ways, except for the city of St. John, New Brunswick. It stands out as an anomaly, okay? Adoption should not be assumed. These are little more than placement within homes, within farms, within artisan shops, okay? Orphan siblings were not supposed to be separated, but they were, and we found time and time again siblings were separated. French Canadians do not include them as family members. So one of the things when we do have a census, and we do have census material from 1851, is that when it was digitized, sheets were digitized with all of the pertinent information, and then it looks like a blank sheet, the way in which the microfilm was taken and then digitized. But there are 2 very important columns. Family member, male, female, non-family member, male, female. And if you just flipped the digital copy over to the second page, you realize that 90% of these children were never considered to be family members. And that was a major breakthrough in this study, was reading, when the census was available, reading it carefully for that. Irish family names were retained, not because Molly Johnson begged them to retain them, it was they were never adopted in the first place and were not obliged. Okay? We do find in census material, though, that Ellen becomes Helene, and Margaret becomes Marguerite, and Patrick becomes Patrice, because the enumerators, at least in the French part of Canada, would enumerate them in their mother tongue. So we do see that, but the surnames don't change. Although, it's important to note that when an Irish child aspirates their name to a French-Canadian unilingual enumerator, interesting things happen. So we were looking for one family from, I'm sorry, I go off on these tangents, but sometimes they're more interesting than what I have to say. So we were looking for the Cox family, C-O-X, big family name in Roscommon, and we had a number of Cox orphans, okay? So one of my students had that on the list. She gave up. She gave it to another student. She gave up. And I said to them, imagine you are a French Canadian listening to a wee child say their name, and it's Cox. Well, we did find them. It was spelled C-O-C-S, not C-O-X. So sometimes trying to track things on a digital array doesn't work. You actually have to go through line by line to discover the names. Holden was another name. We had a number of orphans with the last name Holden. Oh, we couldn't find the Holdens. And I said, imagine the child saying it and not aspirating. We found them as Olden, not Holden. So sometimes even when you have the census, you have to be, how should we say, imaginative. and putting yourself into this different role. And that proved to be a little success. Some married locals, some moved on. A lot of them moved on. Oftentimes to the United States, where they would have had families or at least connections with their village, and they become part of a chain migration. Daniel Ty, sad to say, he was atypical. He did inherit the farm. He did leave a legacy. We could track him, but we also had an oral tradition to back it up. And so that's actually Strokestown Park House in Roscommon, where the Ties would have never been allowed to walk because it was the estate of the Mann family. So there we are, a little snippet of a huge story, a tip of a much larger iceberg, and the research continues. Not by me, but but indeed, the stories never end. Books are not definitive, and there will be more stories to mine as our resources become better. So that is it for me, but I will take questions if necessary.
So first of all, thank you for giving me some ammunition when I proselytize about the importance of the census when the card comes in every few years. But I'm curious, was there any tie back to Ireland, particularly for the full orphan families? Were there ever ties back to Ireland? Were there attempts to repatriate or put them in touch with family?
No, not that we've discovered within the records, although one of the Quinn brothers, one of the priests, Thomas Quinn, he actually goes back to Ireland, and he's the first of the group of 44 orphans from Roscommon that we tracked that actually went back home. An even better story, okay? In 2013, the Irish government decided to have something called the Gathering. And it was Irish descendants could come back to Ireland and be celebrated in their home villages. The Gathering was actually the brainchild of our current Irish ambassador to Canada, John Concannon. And so the Callery family at Strokestown, and we saw the house, who essentially invested their own money to create this museum, decided when they heard the story of Daniel Ty, Jim Callery actually went to Canada and presented a monument to Quebec City, and then invited Richard Ty, who you saw in one of those early pictures, to come back to Ireland during the Gathering. It was covered on national television. Great-grandson of an orphan coming back to Ireland and meeting the Ties that had stayed behind. The Ties in Ireland couldn't speak French. Richard couldn't speak English, but they talked farm, and they walked together in the fields. People, Carolyn Callery told me, she said, when Richard and his wife walked down the streets of Strokestown, which is not a very large place at all, people would come up and touch them. That living link with the past and with the tragedy that had happened in the Strokestown area. So we do have isolated stories of the return. He was presented with the keys to the village. There was a great celebration. It was really quite moving when you saw it on television, on Nationwide. It was well covered. And that's how eventually I was involved in 2013, because Carolyn Callery, the force of nature that she is, said to me, we met at a conference, and she said, "We found Daniel and Catherine Ty. Could you find the other 1,488? And like an idiot, I said, I'll try. Yeah. It's quick back.
What would be the age range of these orphans?
So the question is, what would be the age range of the orphans? And so we would have them all from infancy up to some are in their early 20s. Most of them would be probably between the ages of 5 and 12. That would be most of them. But the infants we have are just listed as infant because no one, left their name. And those would be brought into homes. We can't trace them at all. unless we were to sort of fine-tooth search certain families to see if any infants arrived, in 1847 and were baptized in the local church, but then we wouldn't know their county of origin or their name. Some of the Irish priests are good because when they record a child at confirmation, they'll actually record county of origin. So, but these are generally children in that range of 5 to 12. We get some 14. Those Sheridan kids that took off from Quebec City to go to Lockport, there was one that was actually 18, and he must have been, or she must have been actually leading the rest of the family to upstate New York. We also have a murder. Did I tell you about it? Yeah. It's straight out of a Stephen King novel. One child who's mentioned in the book, his name was John O'Connor, and he would have been about 8. His family had come before 1847, but from this estate in Roscommon, the O'Connors, Mary and Patrick. Thomas Brennan and his wife, we don't know her name, she died at Gros Isle, and one of the children died, but he brought a teenage daughter with him, and they end up in the Niagara in 1848, and then things go sideways. Children playing along the Niagara Escarpment by the Niagara River find the decomposing bodies of Patrick and Mary O'Connor. He had been bludgeoned with a hammer and she had been assaulted. And Thomas Brennan was arrested in Toronto trying to sell clothing that obviously belonged to Mary O'Connor and carrying a wad of money that Patrick had been saving up to bring other daughters over. But this orphan who was made, John O'Connor, was actually tossed over the Niagara Escarpment and actually crawled up and was rescued by the Hopkins family. Thomas Brennan was hanged for his crime, and so we have orphans that are made in a variety of ways, and this one was 8 years old, but I had to tell this murder story in some way. It was something that was beyond belief, but these were our children as well.
Clarification, at the very beginning of your talk, you talked about 110,000 immigrants coming over, and I'm just not clear, is that the total number of Irish who came over in those 400 ships in that year? And if that is the total, then what percentage of them became orphans?
Okay, so out of that 110,000, they would be Irish people recorded leaving UK and Irish ports. And there would be other non-Irish dispersed into that. So by the time they arrive, about 5% of them have died at sea, depending on the boat. So for example, the Virginius, which sailed out of Liverpool, and many of our migrants sailed out of Liverpool because the shipping was cheaper out of Liverpool than other ports. Some of the casualties on board those ships, like the Virginius, were up to 1/3 dead. So you imagine that of the 107,000, then you take away that, you're looking at about 2% of that total were orphaned that we know about, that we actually have a record for. So about 2%. And then when we say orphan, were these people, these children without both their parents, were they half orphans? So that we haven't parsed out because as I've repeated, the primary sources fail us in many ways because we just don't have them. But I would say about 2%. And then of course, Irish migration drops after that. So it picks up to the United States. 1847 is an interesting tipping point because as Canadian authorities in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia tighten up their regulations akin to those in the United States and then charge captains for bringing ashore diseased people, the rate of migration drops to about 30-some thousand the next year in 1848 and never recovers. Whereas in the United States, it continues to go up. So about 119,000 in 1847 go to US ports, 110,000 to Canada, and then it just Canada drops and the US goes on. So the famine really is the end of Irish mass migration. 1847 marks the end of mass migration to Canada. And we shouldn't lose track of the fact that 450,000 Irish migrated to the British North American colonies before the first potato rotted in the ground in 1845. So it's really important to note that there was already a settlement grid. There was already Irish institutions and churches that were here, so that when famine migrants came here and they elected to stay, many went on to the United States because essentially fares were cheaper coming to British North America than they were to the United States. And so many end up in Ohio, Michigan, New York, Vermont, and even as work becomes available, they move on from, repairing the Welland Canal on the Niagara, and they go to Michigan and Illinois and other places. So there's this flow, this constant movement. And that's why it's hard to sort of carry the stories beyond the first or second generation, because these are people on the move. It's really difficult. Sorry, I've expanded beyond what you asked, but yeah.
The Catholic Church had on Irish immigrants. Looking at the other direction, is there a discernible effect of the Irish famine, orphans, and immigrants on the shape of Canadian Catholicism?
That's a good question. I mean, in terms of, how many sort of adopt religious vocations, for example. There are a number of young sisters in Quebec that are taken in by a variety of women's religious orders. And so there is a kind of a personal impact that way. I mentioned the two Quinn brothers, and those who stayed would have become part of congregations. There's all kinds of people, or children I didn't mention, that would have become stalwarts in congregations. But the thing is that the records sort of fail to let us know, as adults, what do they do within the structures of the Catholic Church in Canada. So, I mean, I would be basically purely speculating to answer your question on, what kind of impact do they have on the church? Well, we know one of the young girls who is taken into to one order of sisters actually writes a biography of Saint Vallier, the second bishop of Quebec in New France, and so some of them are contributing that way to arts and letters. Yeah, that's about as far as I could go with that one. Yeah, thank you for the question.
I'm Sarah Monton, and I'm a professor in the Department of English, but also the Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Support in the Faculty of Arts. So I just wanted to thank Dr. McGowan for coming here again. Hopefully it doesn't snow, and sharing this really important, compelling, but often moving material with us tonight, and these issues, of migration and displacement, hunger, family, but also first responders. I found really quite compelling, and I'm sure our audience members did as well. And the one thing I wanted to note that I think is important to us here at St. Mary's, and is so good to hear, is about the inclusion of undergraduates in research of this kind. I mean, I think you can't overstate the importance of that. So on that note, I will say thank you, and also again say please join us outside for the reception, where you will also find copies of the book available, and I was reminded that there is a sign-up sheet for those of you who would like to attend future events of this kind, so please drop down your email address. So with that, I will say thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.